pitch for myself. Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. I want to thank everyone who's already ordered my brand new book, the 10th anniversary edition of Unprocessed. And if you order it before midnight on Sunday, April 3rd, we will send you almost $100 worth of bonuses. I will put that in the chat and in the show notes and let you know how you can get the audio version before it comes out on Audible, and many private cooking classes with me. And I thank you so much for your support. My guest today is Dr. Nathan Bryan, and he is considered by many people to be the world's leading expert on nitric oxide. And we are going to learn all about functional nitric oxide nutrition today. Please welcome him to the show. I'm so happy you got the memo about what color we were both going to wear today.
Right. Well, I can tell you it was rushed. I just landed from a flight from Vegas. So yeah, this was my flight gear. So we match. We're in sync.
It's funny because I wore, not a lot of people wear orange, and I wore orange a couple of weeks ago, and Dr. McDougall and his wife were both wearing orange. So I guess I must have the psychic chip. But, men look good in pink. A lot of men don't wear pink. I think it's a great color on guys, personally.
Yeah, well, we have to stay in touch with our feminine side at times.
So a couple of weeks ago, I did my 900th show, and my guest was Dr. Esselstyn and his wife, Ann, and he started talking about nitric oxide. And it was a little bit over the head of me and a lot of the viewers. And I know that this is like your life's work. And so,
right.
Why are you so interested? First of all, what is it? And why are you so darn interested in it?
Well, it's now recognized as one of the most important molecules produced in the body of humans. In fact, all mammals. I got interested in this back in the early 2000s when I was a student at LSU School of Medicine, working on my Ph.D. in molecular and cellular physiology. So nitric oxide, a Nobel Prize had just been awarded for its discovery. We knew it was important, but there was still so much we didn't know about this molecule. In fact, how it's made in the human body, what goes wrong in people that can't make it, what are the consequences of that? And then at that time, there was no therapeutic strategies known to restore nitric oxide. So that became my life's work. And that's what I've been doing for the past 22, 23 years now.
Oh, that's so interesting. They call it the magic molecule, don't they?
They do. It is somewhat magical. Magic means that there's no science. It can't be explained. So years ago, it was considered magical. But today, the science is very well elucidated. But it's a gas. It's produced in the lining of the blood vessel, and it's a signaling molecule. So it's how cells in the body communicate with one another. It regulates blood flow and oxygen delivery. It's important for cognition and our immune function, especially over the past 2 years. We've learned how important nitric oxide is for fighting respiratory viruses, including the coronavirus. But what we found is that the older you get, the less nitric oxide you make, and that's what's responsible for age-related disease, things like cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, heart disease. So it's critically important, and now we know what goes wrong in people that can't make it. We know how to fix that, both through some drug therapy and technology, but most importantly for you and your audience, we know how to fix this through diet, through food, nutrition, and diet.
That's amazing. You say what goes wrong with people as they age, but young people get heart disease now.
Yeah, that's right. Look, it's a mixture of both diet and lifestyle. We really can't blame it on genetics anymore because we now know how to turn genes on and off. But it's our diet and lifestyle. It's a poor diet. It's a sedentary lifestyle. We now know and have evidence that if you use mouthwash, you become nitric oxide deficient. And there are 200 million Americans that use mouthwash every day, and 200 million Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure.
That was so interesting when I heard you say it's better to have bad breath than to have a heart attack.
That's right. Yeah, there's truth to that.
I never understood mouthwash. I personally find it disgusting. I've never used it with a couple of exceptions. When you get your teeth clean on the very last swish, they give you a little cup with a tiny bit of mouthwash. I figure twice a year, it's not going to kill me, but mouthwash seems so incredibly unnatural.
Look, it's just like overusing antibiotics. The bacteria that live in and on our body are there to do important things for us as humans. It's a true symbiotic relationship. So just like if you take antibiotics, it kills the microbiome and the bacteria in the gut. If you use mouthwash, it kills the bacteria and the microbiome in the mouth. And there are serious consequences of that. We and others have published that if you use mouthwash, your blood pressure goes up. If you use mouthwash, you lose the protective benefits of exercise. So it's a horrible practice. And I tell people, if you're using mouthwash, you absolutely have to stop.
Do dentists not know this? And, you never see this advertised, like, or have mouthwash with, scope with a warning label, may impair your nitric oxide.
Well, no, they're not. They're catching on though, because I lecture at a number of dental conferences, and that's been their standard of care for the past probably over 100 years, and now they're realizing the consequences of that, and they have to mitigate the effects of that. So I think for periodontal disease or gingivitis, there's some acute treatments that can mitigate the gingival bacteria that are causing periodontal disease, but you can't sterilize the entire mouth. There are serious consequences to that.
I don't think people realize there's a microbiome in your mouth as well as in your gut.
Yeah, no, we started that, probably 15 years ago, because we were recognizing that, and this explains a lot. Like for me, the biggest thing is it explains resistant hypertension. And so most people with high blood pressure put on blood pressure medicine. And yet 50% of the people that are given blood pressure medicine, their blood pressure doesn't respond or get better because it's the wrong target. What we're finding is hypertension or high blood pressure is a symptom of oral dysbiosis. So no wonder the targeted drug therapy for, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, calcium channel antagonists, no wonder they don't work to normalize your blood pressure, because that's not the target. It's the bacteria problem in the mouth.
That's really something what you said, that a mouthwash negates the effect of exercise. Because I do spinning for an hour, and it's like, I would hate to think that would like undo all the positive effect just by rinsing my mouth with mouthwash.
Well, people have good intents. I mean, we try to do the best for our health and fitness, right? But I think people just don't realize it just because the information's not out there. But yeah, if you eat a plant-based diet, a raw diet, a vegan diet, but yet you use mouthwash, you lose the benefits of that. Similar, if you're exercising, you use mouthwash, you don't get the benefits of that.
Right. I wish more people would know this, because that was really, for me, it didn't make a difference because I wasn't using it, and I wasn't using toothpaste with fluoride, but my husband was. And I was like, it was, thank you for hearing you talk on Rick Esselstyn's podcast. I said, I basically just threw his mouthwash out,
Yep. Yeah. And the other thing is fluoride toothpaste. Fluoride's a neurotoxin, it's an antiseptic, and it, affects your thyroid function. So you have to stop using fluoride toothpaste, and there's fluoride in municipal water. So I encourage people to get a home filtration system to remove the fluoride from the water they're bathing in, they're drinking in, they're cooking their vegetables in. It's horrible. It's horrible for your health.
So what kind of filtration system are you recommending? So the Berkey isn't enough for removing the fluoride?
Well, you really need to get a whole house system that filters all the water coming in, that you wash your clothes in, that you bathe in, that you all that. But there's some really good systems out there. I use a company called pH Prescriptions out of Florida. They have some pretty cool technology that removes not only, chlorine and fluoride, but, drug metabolites that are found in municipal water. But it just cleans it up, because there's nothing more important than good water.
Yeah, thank you so much. Kathy says, what about brushing your tongue? Is that okay as long as it's not fluoride toothpaste?
No, that's right. So the bacteria that we're most interested in, the ones that are affected by the nitric oxide production on the dorsal part of the tongue, kind of near the gag reflex. And so you can brush your tongue. I encourage you to brush your tongue, but just don't gag yourself. Don't go all the way back. But we've also done tongue scraping. We've done studies in tongue scraping. We find that people that scrape their tongue once or twice a day seem to have lower blood pressure than those that do not. So we think, and we can rationalize this, because you're increasing the diversity. When you clean up the landscape, it allows some other bacteria and the increased diversity, and allow the good guys to flourish and keep the bad guys at bay.
That's really fascinating. My blood pressure is on the low side. So is it better that I don't scrape?
Well, the human body is a remarkable organism in that it always will regulate your blood pressure. But typically people that have really low blood pressure, it's a sign of, a thyroid disorder, hypothyroidism.
I actually have that. You're very smart. So thank you so much. So we have a question from Becky, who's watching live. How do you increase nitric oxide?
A very good question. And so the answer is you have to do two things. Number one, you have to stop doing what disrupts nitric oxide production. So as we mentioned, you have to stop using mouthwash, stop using fluoride. If you're on an antacid, you have to get off antacids, because those three things shut down nitric oxide production. So once you do that, then you can start doing the things that have been clinically proven to restore nitric oxide. So number one, moderate physical exercise. We have to move. That stimulates nitric oxide production. Throw in some more green leafy vegetables that are enriched in nitrate, and don't boil them in water because those nutrients come out in the water. So it's best to eat them raw or in a smoothie or steamed. And then the other is, sauna, get some sunlight or, some infrared light therapy. And then when all else fails, we have some safe and effective nitric oxide product technology on the market.
Yeah. So I have TMJ. So having greens raw is really hard for me. So I steam them, but I always drink the water. Does that help?
No, when we do the extractions, that's exactly what we do. We boil the vegetables. We cut them up into small pieces. We boil them, and that's how we extract the water-soluble nutrients out of there. So yeah, you're getting a lot of the water-soluble nutrients when you drink the water. When people boil their vegetables and just drink the vegetables, most of the nutrients, at least the water-soluble nutrients, are left in the water. So you should always drink the water and cook your vegetables.
Thank you. People think I'm crazy. And I learned years ago, it's called pot liquor. And to me, it tastes like vegetable broth. And so I've always enjoyed the cooking liquid from all my vegetables. I save it and I drink it instead of coffee in the morning.
And look at you. It works.
Thank you. I'm going to be 62. I'm going to be 62 tomorrow.
Incredible. Happy early birthday.
Well, thank you so much. You're so kind. So here's a question from Tammy, a live viewer. Can pulmonary hypertension be caused by, she writes, nitrite oxide? I think she must mean nitric oxide.
Yeah. So whether it's systemic hypertension or pulmonary hypertension, the underlying problem is you've lost the ability to produce nitric oxide, which dilates the blood vessels. So if you can't dilate the blood vessels are constantly constricted. It doesn't matter if it's the blood vessels in your heart, in your brain, or in your lungs and in your sex organs. Then they don't perfuse. And so you've got a very tiny blood vessel with the same amount of blood flow. And so that increases blood pressure. And so if you restore nitric oxide, you can normalize systemic blood pressure. You can normalize pulmonary pressure. You can improve sexual function. I mean, it's all about blood flow, regulation of blood flow. And that's what nitric oxide does.
Yep. Angela says she sends several of her clients with cardiovascular disease to your website to learn about things, and that she appreciates your effort. Do people ever confuse nitrous oxide with nitric oxide? Nitrous oxide is laughing gas that you get at the dentist, right?
Yeah, it happens all the time. Even when I go and do, grand rounds or talk to physicians, they still call it nitrous oxide. So they sound very similar, but they're completely different. I mean, nitrous oxide is N2O. That's the dental anesthetic that you use, or laughing gas. And nitric oxide is NO, one nitrogen, one oxygen. But although they sound very similar, different biochemical properties.
Right. Here's a question from Janet. What about hot tubs? Is bromine dangerous?
Yeah, bromide is just like, it's a halogen. So if you remember from the periodic table, it's the same. The last row on the periodic table, they're called halogens. It's where fluoride, chlorine, iodide, bromine, all those elements reside. And so the best example is we need iodine. Most Americans are deficient in iodine. We need iodine to make stomach acid. We need iodine for our thyroid to work. But if we're exposed to things like bromide or fluoride or chloride or chlorine, then those act as inhibitors and a competitor to the binding of iodine. So that's why people have hypothyroidism, because we're exposed to fluoride in the water. There's bromine in things like Mountain Dew and, stuff. It's a preservative. So you have to avoid all of those halogens except iodine. Iodine is the only one that we need for normal cellular function.
Wow. I used to love Mountain Dew. It's been a long time, but I did love it.
Bad for you.
I know all soda's bad for you, I'm pretty sure, but we're talking many, many years ago. So so there's a question. I would imagine any tooth brightener or tooth bleach would be detrimental to our mouth microbiome.
The short answer is we don't know. When we were kind of hot and heavy in this research, we filed for a number of grants from the National Institute of Health. And although I think this is probably one of the most important areas of research, we had a very difficult time getting these government agencies to fund this type of research, because if you think about it, it's really disruptive. It's disruptive to the dental practice. It's disruptive to, big pharma and drug development. If we can cure cardiovascular disease simply by eliminating things rather than putting people on prescription drugs, then that's a little bit disruptive. So, but here's what we do know. We know that all mouthwash, whether it's, chlorhexidine, potent antiseptic, whether it's alcohol-based mouthwash like Listerine or Scope, and even hydrogen peroxide is indiscriminate. All of those kill bacteria. They don't discriminate between the bad bacteria and the good bacteria. And in most people, the good bacteria always outnumber the bad bacteria. So when you indiscriminately kill the microbiome and decrease the diversity of the bacteria in the mouth, that's a bad thing. We see blood pressure go up, and we see a lot of bad things happen. We get yeast overgrowth. And so we have to maintain this ecology. So, I get questions all the time. Well, what about, essential oils or what? And the short answer is we just don't know. We haven't done the experiments to do it. But the cool thing is I developed these salivary test strips about 12 years ago that you can apply some saliva to the end of this test strip. And if it turns bright pink, then typically that tells us that you have the right bacteria that are reducing nitrate to nitrite. We can pick that up.
Wait, where do we get these? Because the next question I was going to ask you, is there a way to test if we are adequately producing nitric oxide?
Yeah, so you can just Google nitric oxide salivary test strips. There's a couple of companies now that offer those, but it's a very simple chemistry. I developed those, I think, back in 2010. But they're pretty good. I tell people they're good tools to have in your toolbox, but it shouldn't be the only thing. There are false positives. For example, you could have all the symptoms of nitric oxide deficiency, like high blood pressure, or diabetes, or sexual dysfunction, and that test strip could light up bright pink, similar to our shirts. And so that would tell us you make sufficient nitric oxide. But if you've got an oral infection, then that's going to be a false positive, because then our immune system is activated in the oral cavity, and that's the source of the nitric oxide. But that also tells us that systemically, you're completely devoid of any nitric oxide.
Yeah. I mean, think about when I was little, they used to give us fluoride treatments at the dentist.
Yeah, you know what? That's called evolution and really progress in terms of advancements in medical and dental, both dental medicine and just regular medicine. We did a lot of things, 30, 40 years ago that we now know were detrimental to the patient and to the population as a whole. But it's just about the right information and, stop doing the things that are now proven to be a detriment to our own health.
I know that happened to me. I had RK, which is, a kind of a surgery for vision. And that was a mistake, but I can't undo it. And now I'm kind of screwed. So hopefully I will live out my life before any problems ensue. But I know what you're saying. Things are never where they're going to be in the future.
That's right.
Yeah. It seemed like a good idea at the time, though.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, well, I did my best. I can't. I mean, what can I do? I can't undo it. So I just I have to live with the consequences and just hope I outlive my cataracts that are forming, because they can't fix cataracts on somebody that's had RK, or they can, but it's really complicated. But I'm going to outlive my cataracts. I decided, because I don't like surgery anyway. So that's just a segue here. So Heather, who's watching live, asks, well, what about combining beets and greens, eating them together?
It's a great idea, kind of theoretically, but we published on this in 2015, and so I've measured certainly every commercial beet product that's on the market. We've actually measured raw beets from the retailer, and a number of different vegetables. And what we find is there's as much as 100-fold difference in the nitrate content in vegetables, the same vegetable, whether it's the same beet, whether it's grown in Dallas, Los Angeles, or New York, and it's the same with broccoli. There's lettuce. So there are regional differences in farming practices. And there are regional differences in soil conditions. And so the nutrient density of all these vegetables, including nitrate, which is what we focus on, there's no guarantee that if you eat beets or kale or spinach, that you're going to get enough nitrate in that one vegetable or one serving to produce enough nitric oxide to begin to normalize your blood pressure. That's the problem, because we thought if we could change dietary guidelines, because the question was, okay, if all I had to do was eat a certain amount of celery or broccoli in one serving, it would generate enough nitric oxide to normalize my blood pressure where I wouldn't have to get on blood pressure medicine. How much would that be? And the answer is we can't make those recommendations, because it depends on where you live, how the vegetables are grown, whether they're organic or conventional. So it's a guessing game. And so I think it's good. There are a lot of other nutrients that you get from eating vegetables. We just happen to focus on the nitrate content because that's what's required to make nitric oxide.
So there's no way of knowing what we're eating, the nutritional value.
No, in fact, there's data showing from the 1940s, there's as much as a 90% reduction in all trace minerals and nutrients in the foods we eat, the vegetables that are grown. We're feeding a growing planet, and we have to, increase the efficiency of production, and with increased efficiency comes decreased nutrient density.
But it's still better to eat vegetables and fruits than even say processed food, right?
No doubt, no doubt. So, the good thing is these things, what's missing in the diet, we can easily supplement. What's present in processed food, it's hard to detox from. So I tell people it's still important to eat a clean diet and throw in a lot of good vegetables, because you're getting a lot of fiber and a lot of other nutrients in there. And then, the best way, really the only way to tell, is to do a blood lab and do a micronutrient analysis and figure out, okay, what are we missing? Because you need certain nutrients in your body in order to be healthy.
Right. So eating this or drinking this, no difference, not going to help.
I don't recognize those brands, but typically those don't do anything, because, especially the chips, because the drying process destroys a lot of the nutrients in that. The powders, depending on where they source the beets, the drying process, 95% of the beet powders out there have no nitrate in them. They do, except turn your poop and pee pink and cause a little bit of anxiety.
Yeah, but the chips do taste really good, I gotta say. Yeah, and especially for travel, I love them.
Yeah.
Dee Dee says, are there homemade concoctions you can use to brush your teeth instead of having to buy expensive organic toothpaste?
Again, probably, but we just don't have the data to definitively say yes. I use a fluoride-free toothpaste. It's not that expensive, but it's I use a brand called Himalayas. I don't have any financial interest in them. It's just I've tested a lot of and tried a lot of fluoride-free toothpaste, and I like some better than others, and it doesn't appear to affect my oral microbiome. And it's pretty inexpensive.
Thank you. Heather wants to know, is seltzer water dangerous?
Seltzer water, typically that's just like an Alka-Seltzer. Typically that's just sodium bicarb. But
I think she means like club soda, maybe, if I understand the question correctly. Let's see. Seltzer water. Yeah, just like bubble water.
Seltzer water, yeah.
Water. Yeah.
Carbonated water. Yeah, I don't, again, in terms of the oral microbiome, we don't know, but anything that alkalizes. So periodontal disease and a lot of oral issues occur when the salivary pH gets too acidic. So if you use, sodium bicarb to alkalize the oral cavity, or most carbonated drinks are acidic, though. So I'm not sure how that would affect, but if the best way to tell is use the test strips and eat, some spinach or eat some green leafy vegetables, and then 90 minutes later, test your saliva. If 90 minutes after eating a vegetarian diet or a meal, you don't turn the test strip pink, then you've got some problems.
Interesting. Even though you talked about supplements, it's supplementing like a crappy diet. That's not going to really help, is it? Like if we just eat McDonald's and take, nitric oxide supplements, that's not going to give us health.
No, but what the data tell us that if you're going to eat a really bad diet, you absolutely need nitric oxide, but it's not an excuse to allow you to eat that. So, my philosophy is people get sick for two reasons and two reasons only. It's their body's missing something that it needs, or it's exposed to something that it doesn't need. And when you eat a McDonald's type food, number one, there's no nutrients in it, so you're becoming nutrient deficient. And then two, there's so many chemicals in there that are bad for you. You're exposing yourself to toxic chemicals that your body at some point has to get rid of.
Wow. You mentioned mouthwash, fluoride, antacid, antibiotics. Are there any other drugs that are unfavorable to our nitric oxide production?
Yeah, what we found was that chronic statins, so these cholesterol lowering drugs, if you use them over time and you get your cholesterol below 200, which unfortunately is the target every cardiologist or every primary care doctor is trying to get, then you prevent the binding of the nitric oxide synthase enzyme in the cell membrane. You need cholesterol to tether these proteins and these signaling cascades to the membrane. And without sufficient cholesterol, then you get a breakdown of the cellular membrane, cells leak, and there's clear evidence now that there's people that have been on statins for a number of years have an increased incidence of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistant, because it's disrupting the cell signaling cascade. Now even some evidence of cancer because it's disrupting the mitochondrial electron transport chain, because we need cholesterol to maintain the integrity of cell membranes. We need cholesterol to make sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen. We need cholesterol to make vitamin D. If you get your cholesterol below 200, you can't make vitamin D. There's an epidemic of low vitamin D. You become hormone deficient. You can't make estrogen. You can't make testosterone, and your body cannot heal. I think that's probably the most overprescribed drug in the U.S. besides proton pump inhibitors.
Yeah. What effect does breathing have on nitric oxide production?
Breathing is one of the ways that our body makes nitric oxide, but it's also dependent upon the function of the enzyme. So maybe I'll take a step back. There's an enzyme in the lining of the cells that line the blood vessels, and that enzyme is called nitric oxide synthase. And I'm not going to bore you with the complex biochemistry, but that enzyme has to be functional. So when we begin to exercise, it turns that enzyme on, and that's what stimulates nitric oxide production. You can also do nasal breathing, deep breathing exercise, and that stimulates that enzyme. But the enzyme is now in epithelial cells of the airway instead of the endothelial cells. And if that enzyme is functional, when you take deep breaths, it generates nitric oxide. You can deliver the nitric oxide gas to the lungs, dilate the pulmonary arteries, reduce systemic blood pressure. But just like the older you get, the less nitric oxide you make in your blood vessels. The older you get, the less nitric oxide you make through your epithelial cells. And so you can actually measure this. We can measure exhaled nitric oxide in young kids, middle-aged, and in older people, even though they're breathing through their nose and doing deep breathing exercises. The older people make far less nitric oxide than the younger people. So we have to restore the function of that enzyme.
You say you can measure it, but like I've never gone to a doctor or a dentist that's ever even said those words to me. So who's doing these measurements? Because I love getting tested for things like this.
Well, there's a gas phase ozone. It's a nitric oxide analyzer that measures nitric oxide in the gas phase. If you go to a pulmonologist or a respiratory therapist, a lot of times they will measure, kind of the expiration rate and functional capacity of the lungs. Sometimes they'll have a nitric oxide analyzer there. There's some portable ones that you can, measure the severity of asthma but we do this in the research lab all the time. It's just not used in the clinical setting.
That's so funny because I actually am going to see a pulmonologist to get some pulmonary function tests, and I am going to ask for that just to see, and then I'll report back how it was. Wow. What a coincidence. Well, you talked about in the research lab. Is that how you spend most of your day doing research? Because I did read one of your papers, believe it or not, Food Sources of Nitrates and Nitrites, the Physiological Context for Potential Health Benefits. I'll post a link to it. I'm not a doctor, but I still thought it was interesting.
Yeah. Now I don't. I retired full-time academia back in, 2015. But I spent, 15 years as a basic scientist, professor of molecular medicine. And that's where we made a lot of these discoveries. But the challenge for me was when you make discoveries and file patents, you create what's called a conflict of interest. And then the institution has to manage that conflict of interest. And then that basically put handcuffs on my research program. So to me, at that point, it was more important to see my discoveries and research see the light of day in terms of product technology, drug development, changing healthcare, changing public policy, than spending more time in the research lab fighting the battles of bureaucracy. And so I moved away from that, and now I still do research, but I've got everything set up at my home rather than a research lab at the Texas Medical Center.
Nice. What about things like sunlight and hydration? How are they important to nitric oxide production?
Well, hydration is critically important, but it's only important if it's hydration with good, clean, fluoride-free water, right? We can toxify ourselves by drinking municipal water. We need water. We need hydration to get the good stuff in and get the bad stuff out. Sunlight is critically important because we know that there's certain wavelengths of light, both on the ultraviolet side of the spectrum, that are important for nitric oxide production, and the near infrared, kind of the red light, the red spectrum of light that can release nitric oxide bound to metals. And that's why people that live near the equator have much lower blood pressures than people who live, for instance, in Scandinavia or up near the Arctic. because the amount of time spent being exposed to sunlight releases nitric oxide and lowers your blood pressure. Those that don't get enough sunlight not only have low vitamin D, but they have low nitric oxide and higher blood pressure.
That's interesting. So where you live matters, apparently.
That's right.
Wow. So does exercise stimulate the production of nitric oxide? And if so, does it matter what kind and how much we do?
Well, it's supposed to. And, there's a lot of published data out there showing that your ability to produce nitric oxide actually predicts your exercise capacity. So if we take young, healthy, well-trained athletes and we put them on a treadmill and then they immediately exercise for, say, 10 or 12 minutes, you see about, a significant increase in plasma levels of nitrite and nitrate. Those are the metabolites of nitric oxide. However, if you take, a 60 or 70-year-old person and you put them on a treadmill and they begin to exercise, they fail to increase nitric oxide production. And in fact, that's the reason they fail an exercise stress test. Because if you increase your workload, like in an exercise stress test, if you increase the incline of the treadmill, your heart is working harder. So you have to supply more blood to that heart to meet the increased metabolic demand of the heart. And the only way you can do that is through producing nitric oxide in the coronary arteries. You can't produce nitric oxide in the coronary arteries, you get changes in electrical activity, you fail the exercise stress test. So in young, healthy people, that's why exercise is cardioprotective, because they generate nitric oxide. In older people that can't make nitric oxide, that's what makes them exercise intolerant.
Wow, that's interesting. So Kathy says, but is swimming in a pool okay because of the chlorine?
Chlorine is a very small molecule and it's absorbed transdermally. I have a pool, but I have a chemical-free pool. I use ozone and ultraviolet light to clean my pool. You can actually drink the pool water. So I tell people you shouldn't spend a whole lot of time in a chlorine pool because it's toxic. It competes with thyroid. And, when you get out of a chlorine pool, you feel tired, you're lethargic, you're just worn out. And it's not because, a lot of it's because if you're actually active, but, kids who spend all day in the pool, they sleep like babies at night, because I think it can be explained because it's killing their thyroid function and just their metabolism is all screwed up.
Well, doesn't Rip swim every day in a chlorine pool?
I know Rip is a competitive swimmer and still does a lot of swimming today. I hope he's swimming in a chemical-free pool.
I'm going to ask him. I'm going to be on his podcast soon. So that's very interesting. Shane says, is rinsing with hydrogen peroxide okay? Her dentist recommends it.
I think on occasion it can be okay, but you shouldn't do that every day, because hydrogen peroxide not only lyses bacterial cells, but it kills human cells too. If you put hydrogen peroxide on a new wound, you can see it start to fizz and bubble up. That's because it's lysing all cells, human and bacterial cells. So on occasions, I think it's probably okay, but it's not something you should be doing every day, because it certainly disrupts the oral microbiome.
Yeah. And Jenny says, what about xylitol that's used in toothpaste and mouthwash? You're saying no mouthwash. I don't get mouthwash. Why do people use mouthwash? If they have bad breath, shouldn't they figure out why instead of just trying to cover it up like deodorant? Or I don't use deodorant either, by the way.
Yeah,
or room freshener. I can't stand those things, those Glade plugins. Oh my God. I don't like any of that.
Yeah, no, we're on the same page. I haven't worn deodorant in probably 20 years, but yet I don't have body odor. So yeah, you make a good point. People want to mask the problem instead of fix the problem. If you have bad breath, then you've got a problem. Why don't we figure out what the problem is? It's dysbiosis. It's bacteria under the arms that are causing the smell. It's bacteria in the mouth that are causing the smell. So fix the bacteria problem. You don't fix it by killing everything and then allowing yeast and mold and overgrowth there. But yeah, you have to. So getting back to the question, xylitol, I think there's some pretty good published studies on xylitol being kind of a prebiotic and allowing the good bacteria to flourish. But it's a sugar alcohol. I think, it's everything in moderation.
Well, I heard that xylitol wasn't good for our gut, that none of the sugar alcohols or stevia and all that stuff was not good for our gut, because there's a question from Faith about natural sweeteners like erythritol, xylitol, stevia, monk fruit, and if they affect nitric oxide production.
Yeah, it's very difficult to interpret the science sometimes, because people do experiments in isolated, contrived systems, and they don't look at the effects on the whole body. So what we think for what I think is, because I've kind of probably the best guinea pig there is, I experiment on myself when I want to answer these questions. And then we can take it into a broader audience or experimental group. But, xylitol doesn't seem to affect the bacteria, my oral microbiome. But, there's some evidence that sugar alcohols, again, will affect thyroid function. Sucralose is certainly not a good sweetener. Monk fruit, again, it takes a lot of that to achieve the sweetness level that you would with something like stevia or these other sweeteners. But anything artificial, I tell people, look, you use it in moderation if you use it at all. But again, it's probably not something you should be exposing yourself to every single day.
Yeah, you talked about not all species produce nitric oxide, but like, for example, my dog will not eat grains. Is there anything I can do to help her production of nitric oxide as she ages?
We're all mammals. We basically have the same mammalian biochemistry, but humans aren't dogs, aren't rats, aren't mice, aren't rabbits. And that's the reason, a lot of drug therapies fail, because they may work in rats or mouse models, but when you try to translate them to human, they don't translate. But with dogs, we're actually working on a veterinary formula for animals. We started out in racehorses, thoroughbred racehorses, because we knew we could improve their performance. And especially in racehorses with what's called pulmonary bleeds, they have pulmonary hypertension. Then after the race, they have pulmonary bleeds, and that's certainly not good for the horse. So we know that we can make nitric oxide and give them the nitric oxide prior to a race, prevent the pulmonary bleeds, and actually enhance their performance. So that's on the performance side of things. On the pets, as pets get older, they get arthritic. They, just like us, depending on what you feed them, they'll get vascular disease. And so, yeah, there's certainly a way that we can enhance that.
Well, wait, if you give that to racehorses, isn't that sort of the equivalent of giving an athlete steroids?
Well, what we do is called recapitulate physiology. We're not giving anything that would be considered doping. We're basically enhancing or optimizing their own physiology.
Nice. Thank you. Well, Susan sent in a question in advance, and she asks, will the Super Beets products lower the numbers too much for someone who already has low blood pressure and a low heart rate?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And we did this, I started that company in 2010 when we first launched that line of products. So the Super Beets was launched, I think, in 2012 or 2013. But the critical question was, if you give nitric oxide to a person with low blood pressure, does it further reduce their blood pressure? And the answer is no. And the real answer is it depends. It's dose dependent. But we generate a certain amount of nitric oxide that the body normally would produce in 24 hours through that technology. So for instance, my blood pressure stays about 116/68. And if I take our nitric oxide product technology, my blood pressure does not change. And if you have low blood pressure, it doesn't further reduce your blood pressure. It's a very critical safety question we had to answer very early on. However, if you have blood pressure of, say, 180/110, then it's certainly going to lower your blood pressure, but your blood pressure needs to be lower.
Wow. Let's see. Here's a question from Paul. Does drinking alcohol kill the bacteria? Are there any exceptions to the type or the amount of alcohol that is consumed?
Yeah, I mean, there's, alcohol is antiseptic, but if you're drinking straight alcohol, like an 80 proof alcohol, then probably you're gonna kill some bacteria. If you're mixing it, I'm a casual drinker. I like scotch and water, but again, a casual drinker, it doesn't seem to affect my oral microbiome. Interestingly, there's this thing called ethanol preconditioning, and we studied this probably about 20 years ago. That moderate alcohol consumption actually protects the heart from injury from heart attack. And the reason it does this is it increases the expression of an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. There's another one called aldehyde dehydrogenase. And those are nitric oxide metabolizing enzymes. So if you upregulate those, you can actually enhance improve the half-life for the bioactivity of nitric oxide. So the cardioprotective benefits of moderate alcohol consumption can be tied back to a nitric oxide related mechanism.
That's interesting. But what about the negative effects that you hear about, like now the new study out of Britain about how it leads to Alzheimer's, or studies that show there's a link to cancer? And what is moderate drinking in the first place?
Well, yeah, I think it's like everything. It's everything in moderation. I mean, too much of it, you're going to get liver failure, you get the vascular inflammation. And really, that's what a hangover is. It's dehydration and vascular inflammation. And when you start to have chronic vascular inflammation, you get plaque starts to develop, you get platelets sticking together, and you can get vascular dementia, you can have a heart attack or stroke. So then there's a certain level where you basically supersede the protective benefits, and then you start on this slippery slope of the devastating effects of alcohol.
Right. Susanna wants to know, by the way, Susanna, thank you so much for the birthday card. Does Dr. Bryan have a book out, or are you considering publishing one? The information is amazing.
I have a couple of books. The earliest book was called The Nitric Oxide Solution that I published back in 2011, 10 or 11, I think. My latest book is called Functional Nitric Oxide Nutrition. Let me have a copy of it here. Functional Nitric Oxide Nutrition.
Is it on Audible?
I believe it is. I think you can get it on Kindle. And then I'm working on a book deal now with my agent. So we'll have a new book out that'll really tell, the story of bringing nitric oxide to life, from the history of the discovery of nitric oxide, from how we figured out how to make a solid dose form of a gas that you can actually productize and have an effect in humans, onto kind of what we see as the future of healthcare and nutrition over the next 20 or 30 years. So we hope to have that book published and out by the end of the year.
Great, thank you. Well, you can come back on the show when it's out, and we'll ask people to buy it. Yeah, thank you. So there's a question from Sharon about caffeine. Is that detrimental to our nitric oxide production?
Yeah, no, we're a society that's really hooked on caffeine. Again, I think it's moderation, because caffeine is a vasoconstrictor, meaning that caffeine constricts blood vessels and reduces blood flow. That's why in some cases it can cause an increase in blood pressure. So I think moderate consumption of caffeine, I'd have 1 or 1.5 cups of coffee every day. Typically, that's my only source of caffeine throughout the day. But, a lot of people who take these pre-workout powders that are just laced with hundreds of milligrams of caffeine, and then they call it a nitric oxide workout or pre-workout. And, these companies reached out to me probably 15 years ago and say, how can you help us make a good product? And I go, one, you got to take the caffeine out. And they go, well, we tried that. If we take the caffeine out, it doesn't work. And I go, well, you don't have a nitric oxide pre-workout. You got a caffeine pre-workout, because you're basically counteracting the effects of anything nitric oxide would do.
Well, we have some vegetable questions. The first one is, what is your opinion on air frying vegetables? Do they lose too many nutrients when they dry out? These are dehydrated, so they're crunchy, but air fryer doesn't quite make them that crunchy.
We've never tested that. And that's the only thing we've done is we've tested steamed versus boiled versus raw. And it's clear that raw is the best. Steamed, you don't lose that much because you're not, the water soluble minerals aren't coming out. But boiling, you completely wash out and extract all the water soluble nutrients in that. But air frying, I'm trying to think where it would go. There's no place it can go. It would have to stay within the vegetable, right?
Yeah, well, do that test, because I love air frying.
I'll do that.
And pressure cooking. Those are my two favorite cooking methods. Heather says, what about eating a large volume of vegetables and greens to compensate for the nutrient variability?
Well, I think certainly a colorful diet using a different variety of vegetables is probably going to give you the best variety of minerals, and kind of, if you eat one vegetable all the time, that's the only one you eat, then you're not going to be repleted in the minerals that our body needs. So I think that's a good practice, regardless, as long as you're not boiling.
Yeah. So there's a question about what you talked about, from TS, the studies that show nitric oxide levels different in organic versus non-organic, but there's no way just a layperson can see that information, is there?
Yeah, we published it. You can find it on PubMed. But yeah, we published that in 2015. And that was really an interesting survey, because I'm a big fan of organic, just because I think it's important that we don't get exposed to the herbicides or pesticides that are on a lot of these vegetables or foods we eat. The problem is, to get an organic label, there's a limitation on nitrogen-based fertilizers you can add to the soil. So as a result, we find that organically grown vegetables have about 8 to 10 times less nitrate than conventionally grown. So I think it's a balance here. You need to eat good vegetables that are grown in nitrogen repleted soil because, the assimilation of other nutrients is dependent upon nitrogen. If the soil is deficient in nitrogen, you're not going to assimilate, like vitamin A or vitamin C or selenium or chromium or zinc or things, essential minerals that we need in these vegetables. There's one, and you may know them, Chef AJ, the Chef's Garden in Ohio. They do the best. They do soil testing. They add nitrogen to the soil, but yet they don't use any chemicals on those vegetables. So you really get the best of both worlds. They're not classified as organic, but they're nutrient replete. There's no chemicals added to them. And it's the best vegetables that I've ever eaten on the entire planet.
Wow. Maybe you can tell me about them. I'd love to have them on the show. That sounds amazing. Yep. And Pat wants to know, can we have too much nitric oxide?
Yes, you can have too much of anything. But the signs of toxicity of nitric oxide, there's only two. It's low blood pressure and a condition called methemoglobinemia. And so what that is you'll start to get cyanotic around the lips, you'll turn purple because you basically oxidize the hemoglobin and the inability to carry oxygen. So you get cyanosis. But that doesn't happen. I mean, you very rarely see that. There used to be a problem with infantile methemoglobinemia when mothers would make up a formula in well water that was contaminated with bacteria. And then so the baby would take it, they would get the bacterial enteritis, and then the endogenous nitric oxide would cause the infantile methemoglobinemia. But as long as you take, you can't overdose on vegetables. You're not going to eat enough vegetables to generate enough nitric oxide to lower your blood pressure, become cyanotic. If you take, we make nitric oxide products, and if you were to take, a whole box of it, you would probably get low blood pressure and probably become cyanotic. But as long as you use these things as instructed and as directed, there's no cause for concern whatsoever.
Okay. Dina says, does adding fat to your greens like avocado or tahini hinder or help the nitric oxide production, or maybe have no effect?
Well, as I said, we need fat, we need good fats, we need cholesterol. I don't think we know the answer to this because we haven't done the experiments. But in some people, you can see this through, blood flow measurements or endothelial function. If you eat too much fat in a single meal, you get what's called postprandial oxidative stress and inflammation. So you're causing inflammation in the lining of the blood vessels by eating that. The good thing is, and we've published on this, that if you have nitrate or nitrite in that diet, you basically inhibit the inflammatory effects of a poor diet or even a high fat diet. So if you're going to eat fat, and this is what I talk about in the book, we have these social norms that really have a physiological root. So what do? We eat our salads. I'm a steak and potatoes kind of guy, a Texan, and I'm a meat eater. But I always eat a salad before my meal. So what happens is by the time that steak comes and I digest that steak, the nitrate and the nitric oxide that comes from eating my salad is then mobilized and protecting the lining of the blood vessels from that fatty meal that I may be taking thereafter. So the point is, if you're going to eat fat or a fatty meal, then you almost have to have some vegetables with it, ideally prior to it, because it takes time for this to be metabolized and active in the body. Then you can prevent or mitigate the inflammation from a high-fat diet.
Thank you. So here's a question. How about drinking an occasional fresh pressed juice? Because you said chewing's important. Dr. Esselstyn says that too.
Well, the masticating the food is really good, but it also, allows for a certain resident time in the mouth for these bacteria to do their job. So when you're just drinking something, there's no resident time in the mouth. It goes directly through the esophagus and the stomach. The beauty of how the human body is designed is that it always recirculates these minerals back in our salivary glands. So if you're drinking a pressed juice from vegetables, 90 minutes after you consume that, the body concentrates that nitrate in our salivary glands. So for the next 5 or 6 hours, we salivate. That gives the bacteria time to reduce that nitrate to nitrite nitric oxide, provided those bacteria are present.
Thanks. Would chewing herbs such as mint, parsley, or cilantro be beneficial to producing higher levels of nitric oxide?
Only if you have the right bacteria. in the oral cavity. If you're using mouthwash, you can do that till the cows come home, but you're never going to get any nitric oxide being produced because humans don't have that enzyme. We're 100% dependent upon the oral bacteria to do that for us.
Great, thank you. And Kathy says, are you friends with Dr. Esselstyn?
I am. We've known each other for a number of years. I was on Rip's podcast, I guess, a couple of years ago. And so Dr. Esselstyn and I, used to have phone conversations about once a week just to discuss things. He's a remarkable man that's made a huge contributions to medicine and cardiology. But I think we've been able to explain a lot of his observations on his patients. Because, in many cases, and he's published on this, he's taken people with severe coronary artery disease and kept them from having surgery and just put them on a plant-based diet and basically cured them of their cardiovascular disease, get complete plaque regression. But there are other patients that he did the same with minimal effects. And I go, well, did you ask those patients if they were on mouthwash? And he goes, I've never thought to ask that question. So now, obviously, that would explain why some people got better on a plant-based diet and why some people didn't. The other is antacids, because if you're taking mouthwash and you're taking antacids, you will not get the benefits of a plant-based diet. The evidence is very clear.
So people are asking what's better, Tums or proton pump inhibitors? Again, I say get to the root of what's causing your GI problem so you don't need any of it, because that stuff can be improved.
Yeah, well, proton pump inhibitors are not the answer. I mean, there's clear evidence now that people who have been on those for 3 to 5 years have a 40% higher incidence of heart attack and stroke. So the observation are there. It causes heart attack and stroke. The mechanism is clear because you're shutting down nitric oxide production. Tums, from what I believe, I've never taken Tums, but I think it's just sodium bicarbonate, which then alkalizes the lumen of the stomach. But gastric reflux is a symptom of insufficient stomach acid production. So physiologically, it makes no sense to give an antacid because we need stomach acid to break down proteins into amino acids. Without stomach acid, we can't break down proteins into amino acids. So then what happens, you get these peptide fragments that are delivered into the gut. The body sees it as an antigen, and then you develop an immune reaction to it. And that's the whole basis for food allergies. When I was a kid, we didn't have classmates that had milk allergies or peanut allergies. All this is new. The reason is when a pediatrician, when a baby throws up, take them to the doctor, they put them on an antacid. So now when they drink milk, they can't metabolize the milk, they develop a milk allergy. Or they eat peanut butter, they can't digest the protein in peanut butter, they develop a peanut allergy. So you cannot not have stomach acid and allow the body to do what it's designed to do. The antacids are some of the worst drugs in the history of medicine.
What about simethicone? Like there's something called Gas-X, which isn't an antacid. It's used for bloating. Have you ever heard of it?
I have. I've never used it. We've never studied it, so I couldn't comment.
Well, you need to get back to work. No, I'm just kidding.
Got a lot to do.
I'm just kidding. I'm teasing you. Okay. Lisa says, how much of our nitric oxide production is in the mouth and how much by the endothelial?
Well, what we're finding is that it's difficult to quantify what comes from each. But what's clear is that one can compensate for the other. So for instance, when we're young, kids can get away with eating an unhealthy diet because they have good endothelial function. But the older you get, the less nitric oxide you're making from the enzyme. So the older we get, the preponderance of nitric oxide we're making comes through our diet and our salivary glands and what's produced by the oral bacteria. But what's clear is if you have endothelial dysfunction, you don't eat a good plant-based diet, or you're using mouthwash or antacids, then that completely shuts down nitric oxide production. You get sexual dysfunction, you get high blood pressure, you get onset of cardiovascular disease, you get vascular dementia, you get Alzheimer's, you get all the age-related chronic diseases you get can be explained by a loss of nitric oxide. So I think it changes over time. When we're young, obviously most of the nitric oxide comes from the vascular endothelium. The older we get, I think it should be a balance. I think, I'm 48, but I have the vascular age of a 24-year-old. And so I think I have a pretty good balance here. I don't use mouthwash. I throw in some green leafy vegetables, but I also titrate up and supplement a lot of minerals and nutrients, including our nitrate.
Michelle says, have you heard about hibiscus tea lowering blood pressure?
We've measured, yes. And so we've measured a lot of this. In fact, what led to a lot of the discoveries and the patents that I have was we were screening natural product libraries, things that, that in traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine that have been used for thousands of years. We were testing them to see if they had a nitric oxide related effect. And so we find, we can explain, we published this, I think, in 2007, that a lot of the benefits of the traditional Chinese medicines, the herbs and the concoctions they put together, work because they generate nitric oxide. Hibiscus, I'm trying to think if that was, we've tested hundreds of these in there, and some are better than others, some don't do anything, and some do a lot.
Lois says, what are nitric oxide supplements?
Well, that's a loaded question. There's been nitric oxide supplements on the market since the late 90s. Once the Nobel Prize was awarded for its discovery, the first kind of class of nitric oxide products were positioned in the pre-workout, kind of the bodybuilding space, and they called them pumps, increased vascularity, and it was just high dose arginine or citrulline. And we know that those products don't work. In fact, in some cases, they can make the patient worse. And then, then there came the second phase of products, which were beetroot products, excuse me, beetroot powders, and 95% of those on the market we've tested don't do anything. We use those as placebos in our clinical trial. But there are some valuable nitric oxide products on the market, ones that generate nitric oxide gas. We've made an orally disintegrating tablet in several of these companies. Now, my companies have licensed those from either the University of Texas at Austin, where I was employed, and they actually own, or University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston, who owns my patents. And then since I've left academia, I've filed new patents and kind of developed a second generation nitric oxide product technology. So we have supplements, we have functional nutrition products. We've got a skincare line now that we can develop topical nitric oxide for fine lines and wrinkles, and for skincare and aesthetics. It's a game changer in skincare and beauty.
Wait, does that really work? I mean, that'll work. I won't need I don't do Botox, but I'm thinking.
No, we're good. Now we've got 4 published clinical trials on our topical serum with, transformative results within 30 days.
God, can I be like a guinea pig? Because if it really works, I will tell everyone.
Well, I'm going to send you some, and you're going to be the N=1 experiment.
No, really, because I've had nothing done. I swear, I get a lot of
beautiful skin.
Thank you. One of my secrets is staying out of the sun. I have my body in the sun, just not my face. You know what I'm saying? And so I wear a full coverage hat, which I did before the pandemic, which is crazy because now people think it's like a COVID thing. But it's not. It's just something. The sun is much stronger here in the desert, and my skin started. Sure. A turn for the worse 3 years ago. And the doctors here, they read me the riot act. They said, this is not LA sun. And so, but thank you. But I would like to, you see that little, that
we can fix that.
Well, that would be amazing, because I'll tell you, when people send me products all the time, and I'll just tell you something about me, Dr. Bryan, if I don't like something or it doesn't work, I don't say anything. But if it does work, I tell everybody. So just so you know.
Well, you know what? I'm still a scientist at heart, and I want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly, because we can't get better if we don't hear honest feedback.
Well, thank you. Andrea wants to know, how much sunlight do we need each day?
I think I haven't reviewed the literature in a long time, but I think, 20 minutes exposure a day to the majority of the body is sufficient. The sunlight that we get your body is very responsive to it. But I think we certainly need sunlight. Avoidance of sunlight, I think, is to our detriment. Again, it's everything in moderation. I live way out in the country, and I have a ranch, and so I work outside a lot. So I'm usually exposed, a couple of hours a day. But, when you start to notice if your skin is turning red and getting dark, and, sunburn is certainly not good for you. It's your body telling you you've had too much. But I think the evidence reveals, 20 or 30 minutes of sunlight a day is sufficient to convert vitamin D, to generate enough nitric oxide to help your overall health.
Right. Nice. Tricia says, is using baking soda as toothpaste okay?
Baking soda is fine. It's actually pretty good because it alkalizes the oral cavity. Most of the gingival bacteria and the caries causing bacteria that causes cavities, they like an acidic environment. And so if you alkalize the oral cavity, then these bacteria typically can't survive. So bacteria, using either brushing with baking soda or just putting baking soda in water and swishing it for 60 seconds to alkalize the oral cavity is a really good practice.
Yeah, it does seem to whiten teeth too, baking soda.
I haven't had that effect. Haven't seen that effect.
Yeah. Okay. So TS says, will increasing nitric oxide help oxygen levels for people with asthma? So maybe they can give up medication?
Yes. Interestingly, we've learned a lot during this so-called COVID pandemic. Because when you get COVID, you lose oxygen carrying capacity of the red blood cell. You get hypoxemia. And one of the most important aspects of nitric oxide is the delivery of oxygen. So you need nitric oxide bound to red blood cells to deliver oxygen. And you need it to take up oxygen in the lungs. So in COVID or even in asthma, the problem is you don't have nitric oxide to deliver the oxygen. And so you see this in chronic COVID patients, that their blood oxygen saturation gets in the 80s or sometimes 70s. They put them on supplemental oxygen, even put them on a ventilator, and yet their blood oxygen doesn't improve. And typically these people are the ones that expire from COVID. So we have, through my drug company, Nitric Oxide Innovations, we have a nitric oxide drug in phase 3 clinical trials for COVID. And we're seeing blood oxygen saturation go from high 70s to high 90s within 8 minutes of taking the active drug. So we think we're basically showing the importance of nitric oxide and oxygen delivery. And it's not just specific to COVID. It would be important for asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or any disease whereby there's reduced oxygen saturation or oxygen delivery to the tissues.
Right. So here's something fun. Angela, who is the one that said recommends your website to her patients, says she's sending me the nitric oxide salivary strips for my birthday. So I'll let you know what
Happy
my
birthday.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that. Do you know why Dr. Esselstyn recommends people, he always says, anoint their greens with balsamic vinegar?
Well, because balsamic vinegar is acetic acid, right? It acidifies the lumen of the stomach. So it helps in the digestion and the breakdown of proteins into amino acids. And two, if you have sufficient stomach acid production, you don't get an overgrowth of the H. pylori bacteria. Those are the bacteria that cause the gastric ulcers. And if you have to have a little bit of E. coli or salmonella on the vegetables, as long as you have stomach acid production or there's an acid environment of the stomach, then you're not going to get sick from that foodborne pathogen. So you have to acidify it. The best way to do it, and I tell people that have reflux who are on proton pump inhibitors, to take a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar before every meal, because then that's basically acetic acid that's acidifying the lumen of the stomach. So if your body can't make stomach acid, then you take acid before and then allow you better digestion of the foods you eat.
Do you personally enjoy balsamic vinegar?
I do. That's why I use oil and vinegar on my salads.
Okay. Well, if you like balsamic vinegar, this show is sponsored by California Balsamic, and every guest, the first appearance, gets 2 free bottles. So you'll be getting an email and you can choose interesting flavors, not just regular, but curry and chocolate and anything you want.
Wow. Score. Thank you.
You see, and you came on the show, even though you didn't know that. Isn't that great?
That's right.
Okay. So will your skincare products help with the loose skin from major weight loss?
Well, we did enroll those patients in a clinical trial, but here's what we know, that just like if, the heart is an organ and the brain is an organ, if you have reduced blood flow to those organs, they fail. The skin is an organ. If you have reduced blood flow to the skin fails. And when the skin fails, what does that look like? Well, you lose collagen, you lose hydration, fine lines and wrinkles appear, the skin becomes saggy. And so what we do when we restore nitric oxide production by application of a topical serum, we flood that area with new blood, with new oxygen, nutrients, and then we enhance cellular turnover. So we slough off the old cells, rebuild new cells. You get enhanced collagen deposition, you get better hydration, and fine lines and wrinkles go away. Now, if you've removed a lot of fat from weight loss surgery, that I'm not sure we can overcome with a topical serum. Now, the fine lines and wrinkles, we certainly have clinical evidence that we can improve that.
That would be so cool. I'm sure you get this question a lot. I actually remember hearing you answer it on a few of the podcasts I listened to from Lisa. What's the impact of nitrate in processed meats, bacon, hot dogs, etc.?
That is a very good question. In fact, one of the earliest questions from 20 years ago. And I know this may be hard for people in your audience to believe, but we've been given misinformation by the media over the past 50 years. Not only with the effects of statins, but in the 50s and 60s, it was realized that certain cured and processed meats have a higher incidence of certain gastrointestinal cancers, small increased relative risk compared to those plant eaters or plant-based eaters. So then the question was, there was an association, not causation. So in order for this to be causative, you have to have a biologically plausible mechanism. So then they thought, the nutritional epidemiologists thought, well, it's the nitrate and the nitrite in the cured and processed meats that form nitrosamines, and then nitrosamines can cause cancer. And that explains it. Well, that hypothesis kind of fell apart, because if that were the case, vegetarians would have a higher incidence of cancer than meat eaters, because 85% of the nitrate exposure comes from green leafy vegetables. Only 5% comes from cured and processed meats. The other 10% comes from swallowing our own saliva. So 85% of the nitrate we get comes from vegetables. Only 5% comes from cured and processed meats. So the whole point of that is that I'm not discounting the fact that there may be an increased risk of certain cancers from those who eat a certain number of hot dogs or bacon or cured meats, but it's not due to the nitrate. That, I think, the science is very clear. In fact, Walt Willett wrote one of the chapters in my book with Joe Lascalzo on nutritional epidemiology, and realized that it's, they got it wrong. It's not nitrate. Nitrate is cardioprotective. Nitrate is anti-cancer.
Wow, that's interesting. Gina says, where can she get your skincare products? I did put a link to your website in the show notes.
Well, the skincare, my job, let me preface that. My job is to provide people with information so they can make informed decisions on nitric oxide products. So, I don't like to push or solicit products on these. It's my job is to teach the public about nitric oxide so they can make informed decisions on products. But it's very searchable. I think if you search my name and nitric oxide skincare, you'll certainly find it. It's the only nitric oxide skincare on the market.
That is very cool. So Gina says, is there a way to find out which beet powders work and which supplements work?
Yeah, the short answer is, it's very confusing. But I guess the short answer is you can look for patents on beet products. I have a number of issued patents through the discoveries we've made, and we've practiced those patents in a number of products. So yeah, look for patents. It's also difficult to, we've got a number of published clinical trials on our particular products, and most dietary supplements and beet powders, don't undergo the time and the resources and the financial resources to do randomized placebo-controlled clinical studies. So we've done that on most, if not all, of our product technology. But yeah, look for patents on products. Look for products that have clinical trials on them. Look for companies that have so-called nitric oxide experts on their advisory board. They're not a company out there that claim they're nitric oxide, but I've been in this field for 20 years, and I don't know anybody that's on their science advisory board, and they've never published a single paper in the field.
Right. I don't know if you know the answer to this. Is Botox and fillers equally bad?
Well, again, it depends on the practitioner. If they don't know what they're doing, Botox is a toxin. It's botulism toxin. That's where Botox comes from. So you're injecting a toxin into your body. So I don't know how good of an idea that is. Fillers they're masking the effects, right? So I think we have to take a step back and get to the root cause of fine lines and wrinkles. And it's clear in the science that it's because of reduced blood flow due to reduced nitric oxide production. There are a number of clinical cases where doctors have injected the fillers into blood vessels and caused enormous damage to their patient. So again, it goes back to the skill of the person doing that. If you've got an esthetician or a plastic surgeon that is skilled in this and has done it many times and knows what they're doing, you take your chances. But I certainly wouldn't go to some novice who's never done this before and say, we can inject you with fillers or Botox, because then the risk far outweigh the benefits.
I'm so afraid. I would love it, but I'm so afraid. And I'm also afraid of looking like this. A lot of people end up looking like. Here's an interesting question. Do you have anything to say about vaporizing medical cannabis and its effect on our endothelial?
Yeah, actually, the science is pretty rich, and there's endocannabinoid receptors throughout our entire body, and there's a clear link between the activation of the endocannabinoid receptors and the stimulation of nitric oxide. So whether it's through CBD-based products or endamide that's produced endogenously that activates these endocannabinoid receptors, there's a link between activation of that signaling cascade, and it's tied to nitric oxide. But again, the enzyme that makes nitric oxide has to be functional. But I tell people too, I think the CBD is the evidence is clear. It's a potent anti-inflammatory. It's calming effect, and I think for certain people, CBD has tremendous medicinal value. But for the casual user, again, I think it's everything in moderation.
What about salt? Does that affect our endothelial in a negative way?
Salt is a broad category, right? I think sea salts, mineral salts, where you're getting things like, not just sodium chloride, but things like potassium and calcium and, sulfates and all types of salts, I think are good. But you have to be careful too, because when you ingest too much salt, it leads to water retention, an increase in blood pressure, and then the increase in blood pressure can cause damage to the endothelium and start you on this kind of slippery slope to cardiovascular disease.
What's the absolute worst thing we can do for our endothelial or nitrogen? I'm guessing smoking is not good in moderation.
No, look, if I wanted to make you sick and be chronically dependent upon medication, I would follow the government's food recommendations and pyramid. I would give you root canals in most of your teeth. I would put you on mouthwash twice a day. I would give you an antacid and tell you to smoke and don't do anything. And certainly do not sweat. And that right there is a recipe for disaster. Cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes. And, frighteningly, a lot of people follow that regimen. And I think that's why there's so many sick people in the US, despite us spending trillions of dollars on healthcare. We have the sickest people in the world.
Wow. Is there a point of no return with nitric oxide production? Or is it, can we say it's never too late if people will start adopting some of these healthier habits?
No, it's clear. We've done studies on this. We've taken people with plaque already developed in lining of the blood vessels, and we start these strategies to restore nitric oxide production, and we can actually see plaque regression. Similar to what Dr. Esselstyn sees in his patients with a plant-based diet, the cardiovascular disease goes away. Now that we understand the biochemistry and the enzymology of how nitric oxide is produced in the body, it's never too late. You can start today and employ these strategies and produce nitric oxide and get the benefits immediately. So in terms of nitric oxide, there's not a point of no return. In terms of certain disease processes, like Alzheimer's or stage 4 metastatic cancer, those are conditions where there's probably the point of no return. Your body's gone way past the point that we can recover and make you better. So I think, what my whole point in all this is, my objective is to give people the information they can need to be proactive and not reactive. Medicine in the US today is a reactive practice, and doctors don't make anybody better. We have to learn enough and employ strategies to take control of our own health and make ourselves better, because doctors aren't doing it by prescribing medications.
Right. And Jesse's saying the standard American diet is wonderful for the pharmaceutical industry.
No, that's exactly right. Repeat customers every month.
So you have freaked a lot of people out. Now they're saying, what about my root canal? Like, you can't really undo it if you've had it. Why are they so detrimental? And should we never have one?
You should never have a root canal. The evidence is clear, really, over the past 100 years, because let's talk about what a root canal is. You go to the dentist, you have a toothache. Why do you have a toothache? Well, you've got an infection in that tooth. So rather than, here's the process. They go in and they take the nerve root out of that tooth so you don't feel the pain. They take the blood vessel out of that tooth. Then they put you on an oral antibiotic. But they've just removed the blood supply to that infection. So the oral antibiotic you're taking is never going to get to the source of infection. So now for the next 10, 15, 20 years, you've got an asymptomatic infection in that tooth, that you can't feel that's isolated from your immune system. And it leads to osteonecrosis, osteomyelitis in the jawbone. A lot of times it'll eat up into the upper jaw and cause chronic sinusitis. And so, yeah, you have to go in to a certain dentist and have them extract the tooth, clean up the infection with ozone gas, and kill the infection. But you should never have a root canal. If you have a root canal, you have to go see someone who knows how to mitigate a root canal tooth.
Wow, that's something new. Wow, that's amazing. Well, when the book come back on, you can wait till the book comes out or before, but this is really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for the work you do, because you're really helping a lot of people, because a lot of people don't know about this.
Well, thank you. That's the beauty of what you do. We can reach the masses and hopefully provide people with some good information that they can then take and employ these strategies to make themselves better.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryan. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back at 3 p.m. when my guest is Dr. Joan Iflin. She is a leading expert on food addiction, is going to be talking about how processed food harms your cells, just like it harms your nitric oxide production. Right,
Sure.
Dr. Bryan?